George Byers is just blasting away on Frank Child's injured eye as we come to the closing moments of the 19th round. The swelling on Child's eye is remarkable. It must be sticking out 2 inches in diameter. It looks brutal. It seems as if there's no way Frank Childs is going to survive the rest of this match. One more round to go after this, and Byers is just taking it to Frank Childs as he looks in severe distress. And that is it for the round, and Childs survives the round. Unbelievable action going on here. So long before Stanley Ketchel and heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey was one of the original Hobo boxers turned champion in George Byers. This is the boxing profile for number 51, George Byers. Born 1872 from Canada and the Pacific Islands. Boxing out of Boston was George Byers. He debuted in 1895 at the age of 23 and ended in 1903 at the age of 30 years old. The bio for George Byers. George Byers was a hobo turned wrestler turned boxer turned boxing legend. George Byers was a link from George Old Chocolate Godfrey to Sam Langford, as he turned boxing instructor and taught Sam Langford many of the tricks that George Godfrey employed himself. George Byers passed those tricks on to Sam Langford and made him one of the greatest pound-per-pound boxers of all time. The fighting style, George Byers would be described as a defensive fighter, fast on his feet. He didn't have a lot of power, but George Byers decided early in his career to make up for his lack of power with cleverness, and a defensive fighter is what George Byers became. The competitive rounds fought, 224 competitive rounds, as Byers was fairly active. My score for George Byers would be 16. Level ups in George Byers' career. George Byers was a combined 0-for-4. 0-3 against George Gardner, light heavyweight champion. 0-for-1 against Jack Ritt, also light heavyweight champion. George Byers' chief nemesis was none other than Frank Childs and George Gardner. Frank Childs is rated boxer number 53, and George Byers is located right next to him at boxer number 51. The greatest achievement, George Byers' greatest achievement would probably be dominating Frank Childs, blooding up his eye, creating a bloody mess of Frank Childs in a 20-round win in 1898. The biggest miss of George Byers' career would probably be not facing Kid McCoy, who did not face any black fighters but was born right next to George Byers in the same year, or facing the Barbados demon George Walcott. Both of these fighters he could have fought in his prime, and both of those would have made excellent matches against George Byers. Now we're going to take a look at George Byers' true potential, and this is how he fared in simulation, how much George Byers was able to overachieve. Simulation wins for George Byers includes wins over Dick O'Brien, George Cole, middleweight Mike Donovan, middleweight champion Jack Dempsey Nonpareil, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. George Byers also had 2 draws with young Peter Jackson, who he was unable to secure a win over. But young Peter Jackson is a very good peer for George Byers. Very equal. You might be wondering how George Byers would do against his mentor, George Old Chocolate Godfrey, who was rated ahead of George Byers. That produced a spectacular match in simulation that included 3 knockdowns and 1 for George Byers, as Old Chocolate George Godfrey secured a 15-round split decision win over George Byers, his pupil. The newspaper depiction for George Byers would be fast feet, very clever, a defensive wonder, and the newspaper described his sparring partner as Hank Griffin during the 1901 year when he was fighting Jack Rutt. So George Byers was doing many rounds with Hank Griffin, who he did not fight in real life, but they fought in sparring. Finally, we're going to look at the birth years master log and see who was born around George Byers. George Byers was born in 1872. Those born around him: 1871, Mysterious Billy Smith. 1871, Charlie Johnson. 1872, Gus Rulin. 1872, Harry Peppers. 1872, Charles McCoy. 1873, George Elbows McFadden. 1873, Dick O'Brien. 1873, the Barbano Stephen Joe Walcott. 1873, Matty Matthews. 1873, Rube Ferns. And finally, 1873, Sailor Tom Sharkey. So all of those fighters are born right around George Byers. As George Byers came up with Frank Childs and Joe Butler and Hank Griffin and all of the fighters just previous to the Jack Johnson, Sam Langford days. They were the original black pioneers, and they fought through the middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight titles. They fought in multiple weight classes, and as I stated, George Byers was the colored heavyweight champion of the world in his career when he won the title, and he represented the colored heavyweight champions with a rather bright future, as he was a very young champion. And now we are going to go through the competitive rounds of George Byers, and we're going to learn how he wins the colored heavyweight champion right now as we take a look at his competitive rounds fought. So George Byers, he stood 5'8.5", weighed 165 pounds. His first competitive rounds match was against Harry Peppers. Now, Harry Peppers does not rank in the top 60 here, But yet this was George Byers' first opportunity to win a title, and this was for the Pacific Coast Middleweight Championship. And at this point, Harry Peppers gave him a very competitive rounds fought. He gave him a very good fight. This is George Byers at the age of 25, and these are the boxing notes for his first crown of any kind. They got together in earnest in the 19th round. George Byers went at his man like a bull rushes a red flag. He caught Peppers hard in the stomach twice and followed it up with a hard left swing, which caused the Californian to fall down to the boards and see stars and go down and out as George Byers secured victory with a 19th round win by KO over Harry Peppers. That was just 2 years after George Byers' debut in 1895. So he immediately became a force upon the boxing scene because he was being tutored by a boxing legend and George Old Chocolate Godfrey. So his advancement rate was rather rapid. And George Byers' next competitive rounds fought would be September 19th, 1898, just about almost a year later from the Harry Peppers match. This was against Frank Childs. And this is where George Byers jumps immediately into the deep end of a competition against Frank Childs, as he was not had much of an amateur background and was young into his career. And these are the notes for the Frank Childs boxing match. In the 5th round, Byers busts up Frank Childs' eyes. So from the 5th round on, Frank Childs has got a cut over his eye, which is causing him problems throughout the match. The 8th round, Childs' other eye was damaged in the 8th round, so now he had 2 bad eyes from the 8th round and on. 19th round, Childs' left eye swollen to a horrible extent, standing out 2 inches in diameter. George Byers having slightly the advantage in the fight. Frank Childs certainly put up an exceedingly game fight. As his eye had not been closed so early in the contest, the results may have been otherwise, as he had vision problems in his right eye and he doesn't know any quit. So Frank Childs put up a very gallant effort, but loses the colored black heavyweight champion to George Byers, as George Byers secures a 20-round win and earns himself 3 points in that. George Byers' next competitive match was 2 months later, December 13th, 1898, against Jack Bonner. George Byers is 26 years old, and the results of this was a 20-round draw. The notes are 20 rounds of fast and furious fighting, the best the bout had seen in ages. The results of the bout was declared a draw. Both fighters were strong at the end. Byers showed a great deal of cleverness on getting away from trouble from Jack Bonner. And Jack Bonner is rated ahead of George Byers here, and the result of the match was a 20-round draw. So this is almost a full year later. This next competitive rounds match, September 4th, 1899, against Tommy West. The notes of the match: with a right hand jolt on the jaw, Tommy West of Boston put out George Byers in the 7th round of the Coney Island contest last night. West was bleeding from the nose and the mouth, and at its close of the 4th round, he had a lump under his left eye. The fight was fast and furious. West working the body often. A right arm jolt flash on the jaw. Byers went down in a heap. The results of the match: 7-round loss on KO to Tommy West, who is ranked far ahead of George Byers here. Again, just a few months later, December 28th, 1899, the next competitive rounds match, Dick O Brien, the big, rough and tough light heavyweight. The results of the match: 10-round draw. Byers was wiry and quick. Both were in excellent condition. The early rounds were even. O'Brien draws first blood in round 4. Byers' left ear begins to bleed. The round closes. Both men were fighting at close quarters, back and forth affair. No objections to the draw. O'Brien was very pleased with his performance against George Byers. And the notes for this was even. So this was 1 point for George Byers. 10-round draw against a much tougher and much stronger opponent in Dick O'Brien. That was George Byers at age 27. His next match would be February of 1900. Again, still the age of 27, against George Gardner, number 1. So this would be the very first level up of George Byers' career. The notes of the match were: George Gardner had all the best of the fight, keeping his opponent on the defensive for all but 3 rounds. Byers had a decent advantage. The results of the match was a 15-round draw against George Byers. This is a very close match, and the newspapers had the fight at about even. That's the notes for that. So George Byers doesn't waste any time, and he later that same month in February 22nd, 1900, George Gardner 2. Byers was DQ'd for hitting a fallen fighter. From the 10th to the close, a roughhouse battle with bad blood between the men. With red blood on both of the men, the referee stopped the fight. Byers had the best of it until the 10th round. After the 10th round, both fighters continued swinging. The 11th round was a hammer and tongue affair, back and forth. Gardner was very effective with jabs as Byers bled profusely. A cut over the left eye and a rapidly closing eye. Gardner cautioned several times for holding. Byers tried to smother Gardner with the gloves, committing several fouls. The 14th round fighting were fierce. While trying to get away from a clinch, Gardner slipped to the floor. Byers rushed at him and made several attempts to hit the fallen warrior. It would be difficult to say who would have won had the match not ended in DQ, as Byers attempted to hit George Gardner when he was down. That was George Gardner number 2, and it's a 14-round loss via DQ for George Byers. So again, he fails to get any points on a level up. So right around the beginning of the 1900, there was big news that Jack Rutt, the light heavyweight champion, draws the color line and did not want to fight George Byers. I don't really understand this too much because Jack Rutt actually fought Frank Craig a few months earlier, so he was black, and I guess Jack Rutt changes his mind because he will eventually fight George Byers here within about a year later. So George Byers' next competitive rounds match is Frank Childs number 2, the rematch. This happens March 16th of 1900, and the results were a 6-round draw. The notes here shows Byers shown himself more clever, but 15 pounds less in weight had its disadvantage. Had Childs not made a good rally the last 2 rounds, he would have clearly lost. Byers, his footwork, blocking, and ducking were clever, and many of Childs' vicious swings were wild and did not land at all, which was very consistent with how Childs fought, as he was a rather crude, primitive fighter. So the results of this match, 6-round draw, and for Frank Childs number 2, George Byers was 27 years old during this time frame, as he is in what would widely be considered the last prime year of many of these pioneer boxers, of 27 years old. And he received 1 point for that. So Byers didn't waste any time here in the year 1900. His very next competitive rounds match is the third match with George Gardner. This happens in May 18th of 2000. This is the last match with George Gardner. And if you remember George Gardner number 2, George Byers got disqualified for hitting George Gardner after he went down from a slip. So let's see how this match happens. Here's the notes from it. This was declared a no contest. It was also described as being a fake fight in the newspaper. Walcott was in George Gardner's corner, and he was taunting George Byers throughout. So what we happened here was a very slow match with not a lot of fighting, and that's how it eventually became a no contest, and 0 points for that. So it was kind of a disgraceful way to end the third fight of the trilogy. So that is what made George Byers 0 for 3 against George Gardner. Although, as you can see there, Gardner didn't win any of those either, because or not many of them, because of a draw and a no contest. So just a matter of a few weeks later was his next competitive rounds match, May 30th of 1900, and that would be with Dick O'Brien. And the results of the match here is a 15-round draw, and these are the notes here. At the sound of the bell, they cut loose. With no regards for scientific efforts, the beginning of the fight was very fast. Through the first 3 rounds were all Byers. O'Brien, after round 4, his aggressiveness began to pay off. In the 9th round, Byers went down in the 9th. He got up in a few seconds, but O'Brien kept after him and knocked George Byers down again. George Byers got up at the count of 9, and the round ends with clinching. Round 10, Byers comes back strong in 10th round. O'Brien continued aggressive tactics, but Byers seemed to be growing stronger. The 14th round, Byers cut loose with a seldom return. The 15th and last round, both men were too tired to box. The bout was declared a draw. Byers' supreme conditioning, coupled with his cleverness, prevented him from losing the fight. The newspaper declared this as probably a win for Dick O'Brien, as the match was really that close. The official verdict was a 15-round draw, but we give Byers a loss for that in the notes, but he still gets a point for a draw. Now finally here, the next calendar year, January 1901, George Byers, 28 years old, and he finally gets a chance at Jack Rutt, the light heavyweight champion. And these are the notes for that. Even until the 4th round. In the 4th round, George Byers' eyes split open. Byers went down in the 5th round 3 times in the 7th, and saved by the bell in the 8th when he went down again. The 9th, Byers was sent down with a right and arose at the count. Byers went down again, unable to defend himself as his seconds threw in the sponge. Byers fought scared and fought like a novice. Now, that was a pretty big level up for George Byers as Jack Root. I guess George Byers is the best black opponent that Jack Root faced, and he pretty much cakewalked right over George Byers, as the newspaper states there. George Byers fought scared and fought like a novice. So that would be a ninth round loss on KO. 0 points for that. 28 years old, George Byers, and March 16th of 1901 is Frank Childs, number 3. Results of this is a 17-round loss on KO. The notes: George Byers lacked vigor and had no steam on his punches. Byers knocked down 3 times before the fight was stopped. It was a very one-sided affair, with Frank Childs getting the better of Byers throughout the match. The 17-round loss on KO, and this is where George Byers is actually starts to lose some of the steam on his punches as he heads past his prime here. I know he's 28 years old, but the Pioneer is at a much shorter time frame for their prime, and in Byers' case, he really started to lose in his power, I guess, or vigor, as they would refer to it as. So his next competitive rounds match was in August, so it would be later on in the year of 1901, against Mysterious Billy Smith. That would be a 15-round draw. The notes here are no blood was drawn and no knockdowns happened. Byers was in pink shape. Smith was fat and not trained. Either the fight was a fake or Byers had gone so far back that you needed a telescope to find the Negro. Even in the back ranks of pugilism's has-beens is where Byers appeared by not being able to knock out the self-described fat and out-of-shape Mysterious Billy Smith. Smith was pretty darn good at lasting these matches out. That was one of his trademarks. Even though he wasn't in shape for this, he was very effective at least dragging out the match in ugly, horrific matches. And Byers, unable to take advantage of it, and finds himself in a 15-round draw. Now, at this point, Byers is 30 years old. This is October 1902, a full calendar year later. Dick O'Brien, number 3, and this is a draw. 10-round draw. And the notes are: O'Brien knocked against the rules once, but in returning, delivered a right and left that staggered Byers. No one had a clear advantage. So the fight was about even, and that was a 10-round draw with Dick O'Brien. His next match would be 2 months later, 1902, December, against Twin Sullivan. Twin Sullivan was a common opponent of Jim Flynn. So let's see how George Byers does against him. So there's not really a lot of notes on here. The contest is described as a very dull affair, very low attendance. The newspaper described George Byers as seemingly dopey and like as if he were drugged, as in dopey, and called it an uninteresting affair. So that was a 6-round draw, which doesn't sound like a very exciting fight whatsoever. So not much to determine as far as who was better there. So finally here, January of 1903, George Byers decides to step it up and face a heavyweight, and that would be Sandy Ferguson. And the results of the match was a 8-round draw, and these are the notes. Ferguson down 4 times and made a mad sprint to avoid punishment. Ferguson hugs, sprints, and goes to the floor to save himself from a knockdown. So the official decision there was a 8-round draw, but that was a win for George Byers, and he received 3 points for that, as Ferguson represented himself very poorly, because he's most likely out of shape there. So we're going to soon get the rematch here. That was in January of 1903, and in April of 1903 is the rematch, just a few months afterwards, against Sandy Ferguson, number 2. The results were a 12-round draw. In the 12th round, Sandy landed at will. Ferguson had an advantage every round. Ferguson's fighting was like a revelation to his friends at the manner in which he handled his opponents. Twice he had Byers staggering around the ring. Sandy had Byers staggering in round 1. Byers fights back hard, but Ferguson takes the last 2 rounds, earning the W. So the official decision was a 12-round draw, but the notes there, the newspaper notes, have Ferguson winning very clearly, as they say, Ferguson's fighting was a revelation to his friends. Now, George Byers has only got 1 competitive rounds fight left in him, and this was in the very next month, May 1903. George Byers is only 30 years old, and his prime was had closed on him pretty quickly, and he was became a very faded fighter very quickly. So May of 1903 was a match with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, 6-round draw, and the first round, O'Brien floored George Byers. The 4th round, Byers got floored again. In the 5th round, Byers' eye closed. Badly outpointed, Byers managed to stay the limit. round 1, O'Brien floored for a 9 count. In the 4th round, Philadelphia set in to end the match and dropped Byers for a full 9 count in the 4th round. The 5th round, a large cut over George Byers' eyes. The last round, the 6th round, he had Byers going and he managed to survive the round just barely. So at that point, just getting annihilated by Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, George Byers decides to call it quits for his career, and that was the last competitive rounds match he would fight. So the Philadelphia Jack O'Brien bout was in May of 1903, and in May of 1904, George Byers retired the following year, having fought a couple of low-level, no-name fighters, and he got a few wins on his career, and he had enough money saved that he opened himself up a gym in Boston and became a boxing trainer, like many of the former boxers, as he became an ambassador to the sport. And I'm going to read you some final notes here as I go through here. In George Byers' first 4 years of competition, he never lost a scrap. And in 1899, he was publicly calling out the world champion Tommy Ryan to put his title on the line. Ryan, however, as was the fashion of his time, was not going to give up his title to a black man, and he drew the infamous color line, refusing to meet George Byers, denying him a much-coveted shot at the championship. In his time, George was a tremendous fighter, smart and very clever. Not for him a cauliflower ear or a dented sneezer, observed Willie McGuffus in the Ring Rambling column of 1975. He was the original pretty boxer long before Cassius Clay started making his boast, and photos of the time show how well George looked after himself in the ring. He never hid and fought the best of his time. He duked it out with every world champion from welterweight through to heavyweight. Jack Johnson, Sharkey, Bob Fitzsimmons, Philadelphia O'Brien, the greatest light heavyweight. He fought 6-round draws in May of 1902. His nickname, Budge, by all accounts, came from the fact that he was hit and he hardly moved and he didn't budge. Some of his fights were exhibitions and many were all-out wars. Even a few were on the quiet, including a bout in May of 1899 against future world welterweight champion Joe Walcott. A private affair held at George Godfrey's gym in front of a few select spectators that was waged on heavily. Byers forced the future champion to surrender after 4 bloody and brutal rounds, although George Byers refused to talk about it in years to come. With no prospect of a title fight because of his color, George Byers soldiered on until 1904 when he hung up his gloves. Upon retirement, he turned to training fighters, and for a short period he was head trainer at Atlas Athletic Club and then Carishian Club. His greatest pupil was Nova Scotland's Sam Langford, considered by many to be the greatest pound per pound of all time. According to Langford, they met when Byers saved Sam from an angry crowd one day. From that point on, they became great friends. Langford credited George Byers with teaching him everything he knew about the finer points of boxing. For over a decade, the two worked together, George acting as trainer, sparring partner, and close friend, traveling the globe and seeing all parts of the world that many people, especially those of the working class, did not have an opportunity to see. George's Byers' association with Sam also afforded him the privilege of being filmed. The only footage of George Byers in existence is that of him training with Langford in France of 1911 and entering the ring with Sam at Los Angeles in 1910. After Sam and George went their separate ways, Byers settled in Boston, where he continued to train fighters and work at local gyms as a boxing teacher. He took on a job on the B&M Railroad for nearly 20 years before he died in Boston City Hospital, either of pneumonia or a heart attack, depending on conflicting reports, in 1937. George's pedigree as a fighter, as a trainer, was first class. He was for many years considered one of the best middleweights in the business, and it was common knowledge that only his color, not his skill or character, prevented him from gaining an opportunity to demonstrate his championship wares. George Byers, boxer, trainer, teacher, and Hall of Famer. And that was the end of George Byers' illustrious career, as he did the entire gauntlet of from being a pupil to a boxer to a wrestler, a hobo, a trainer, and then a teacher, and then a Hall of Famer. As he led a very prestigious, illustrious career, and one of the greatest achievements, I guess, of his career was that he ended in his fighting career in good health and lived to be a long career after his fighting things. And he died at 64 years of age, so he had a very full life, and it was an amazing story. Thank you for listening.